I'm learning as I go along that if my primary job is to lead, then my primary resource for leading is listening. And we learnt this in Gateway very, very early on, and I've frequently been sort of, reminded by it. I really wish I had time to tell you about how we got our name, for instance. The name is a little thing, but for us it was a very big thing. It was a big lesson about what happens when you listen and pray. And if you want to know more about it, then get in touch with me. And when someone comes to speak to me about planting, any kind of planting, whether it's church planting or setting up a missional community or a new fresh expression or project, one of my first questions always is, what's your story of discernment? What's your sort of Exodus 3 moment? Why are you doing what you were doing? And if the answer is, honestly, I don't know, I don't really have a story of discernment, then my advice is clear the decks, clear your diary, stop the clocks, do what you must do to hear and discern the voice of God on your journey. And then don't stop. Keep it up. Keep it going. Make it part of your routine. Make it part of your diary. There's a famous verse in Proverbs 29:18, which used to be translated, where there is no vision, the people perish. And this verse has been quoted in Christian leadership seminars for ages. I've heard it said many, many, many times. But I've only recently noticed that in my Bible they've updated the translation, because this word isn't vision at all. The meaning of the Hebrew word is more accurately translated a prophetic revelation or a prophetic vision. Proverbs 29:18 actually says that without prophetic revelation, without the voice of God, the people go astray. The vital thing is the voice of God, the discernment of God on any given situation, and that you are following it. And can I say something to you that not everyone will sort of agree with? As leaders, plans and decision making and good ideas are not our priority. A brilliant Christian leadership guru once said this: plans are useful for simple things, but not complex ones. The planning process is useful, but plans are useless. And that not so brilliant leadership guru, but brilliant, or used to be brilliant boxer, Mike Tyson famously said, everyone's got a plan until they get a punch in the mouth. And John Wimber, that remarkable kingdom pioneer, once said, I am in favor of planning, but only after God speaks. And someone else said, the failure to bring about change has never been for want of a good plan, but the lack of leadership. And leadership comes when your story, your movement as a story of discernment, and when prayer is more important to you than planning, and discernment is more important than a decision making. And originally I was going to mention a whole bunch of other things, but as I was praying for this session, I just felt as if God prompted me to tell a story, and so here it is. Every summer I set aside a week of prayer, and the sole purpose of that week is to hear God for the year ahead in Gateway, and I'll share more about that as we go on. And every year God seems to speak in a really precise and remarkable way about our overarching theme for the next year. And every year I come with a blank piece of paper, and I have to say, with not a lot of faith, and I think, this year is going to end up with nothing. And every year God speaks. And this year, a couple of years ago, just before I went, one of my leaders who has a really strong gift, prophetic gift, sent me an email saying, I was praying sort of today, and I felt God give me a word for Gateway for the year ahead. And because of her really remarkable gift, I opened the email with real sense of anticipation, and what is it going to say? And she said, I felt the word was Psalm 127 verse 1, unless the Lord builds the house, the workers labor in vain. And I have to say, I read it, I thought, okay, it's not sexy, it's not pretty remarkable, but it's not offensive, so I'll put it on the kind of pending pile and see what happens. And so I went away for the week of prayer, and I felt prompted that week to read the lectionary. I've never read the lectionary for more than a day. I'm a bad Anglican, I never have. But I felt that week that it was right to. And I'll never forget, on the Tuesday of that week, opening up the set reading for that day, Psalm 127 verse 1, unless the Lord builds the house, the workers labor in vain. And I went away on holiday a month or so later, came back, trawling through all the emails that inevitably are waiting for me, and sort of randomly clicking through, and I came across a email that I got from I think it's called the Glasgow Prophetic Centre. I don't know who these people are. I don't know how I ended up on their mailing list, but every year or so, I ended up, at different times of the year, I ended up getting an email from them. And I opened this email, and across the top of this email, in big bold letters, Psalm 127 verse 1, unless the Lord build the house, the workers labor in vain. Not once, not twice, not three times. Suddenly, of course, you start to pay attention. God is trying to say something. A couple of months later, I was sitting with the group of leaders in Wigan from different churches who meet for kind of prayer every week. And I was beginning of the year, and I was just praying, Lord, what is your word for us in this year, for this group of leaders here? And suddenly it came into my head like a hammer blow. I hadn't been thinking of Psalm 127 for a while, but it came into my head so hard and so quickly that I spoke up in this meeting and said, I said, friends, I've been asking God for a word for us, and I think it's Psalm 127 verse 1, unless the Lord builds the house, the workers labor in vain. I just think it's that. About 5 seconds later, I felt a buzzing in my pocket, and I reached into my pocket to pull out my phone. Usually I ignore it to the frustration of my friends and especially my wife, but for some reason I reached into my phone, my pocket, put out the phone, and I clicked. I was in the middle of a prayer meeting, for heaven's sake, and I clicked on the email, and it happened to be from a guy I didn't really know. He's a church planter who sends out a newsletter every 6 months or so, and I clicked on it, and across the top of this email, in again great big bold letters, Psalm 127 verse 1, unless the Lord builds the house, the workers labor in vain. Not one hammer blow, not two, not three, not four, but 5 times. And I mention it now is because I felt, even at that moment, that this wasn't just a call of God for Gateway for that season, which it was. And it wasn't just a call of God for the sort of leaders in Wigan at that moment, which it was. I believe it is the clarion call of God over all his pioneer leaders. Unless the Lord builds it, it ain't going to work. It ain't going to work. All of us labor in vain. We know that in our minds. But unless it translates into how we build, how we plant, how we lead, my friends, it ain't going to work. If you take nothing else from everything else we talk about in Cultivate, then take this. And if there's anything I would plead with you about, if there is anything that you can do that will advance the kingdom and make the work of planting and leading come alive in you, then let the Lord build it. I would urge you to sort of set up a pattern and routine in your life so prayer becomes the cornerstone and discernment becomes your pattern. Most of us assent to that. Most of us say that sounds good, that prayer is more important than planning, and discernment more important than decision making. But our diaries often say otherwise. Let the Lord build it, and then it doesn't matter how capable or incapable you are. He's doing it anyway. Discernment and prayer is only a priority if it actually happens. You can only prove this with your diary. Your plant, your community, whatever you're leading, will only fly if the Lord builds it, if this defining principle underpins it. Prayer is more important than planning. Discernment is more important than decision making.